Welcome to Top M&A Entrepreneurs. Today, my guest is Jed Morris. Jed is a, let's say, ETA-er, business buyer, who's got a great story about what not to do, but he's also a veteran and he works in the tech world and pretty active on LinkedIn and all the other social medias. But Jed also has a book out called Lessons from Failed Business Buyers. I think that's coming out pretty soon. So, Jed, I want to welcome you. And then just tell me your story.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here. And just to clarify, yes, putting a book together. Pre-sale is available, but its book is scheduled to come out this fall, right around the Halloween timeframe.
Love
So
it.
really excited to get that out there. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So, all right, let's rewind a little bit. And I'm sure you've told this story a lot of times in your head. So how did this start? How did you become like, okay, I'm just going to leave W-2 or the military status and then buy a business?
I think it started the way it starts for a lot of people. I was a 10-year Air Force veteran, got out in 2019. Wasn't sure exactly where I wanted to go, but I knew that, spending the next 20 years in the DoD was not the future I wanted. Although it was like laid out in front of me, right? So I joined NYU.
Yeah, just 10 more years. Just 10 more years.
Yeah,
and you get a nice,
yeah. And even better, I left the Air Force and walked directly into a GS-13 spot right near the Pentagon. So like I was set. I knew that GS-15 was around the corner. Then the whole whatever I wanted was right in front of me. As long as I was okay with working in the Pentagon in DC for the rest of my career. And it's just I wanted something else. I was ready to move on and do something else, but had no idea what that was. Joined NYU Stern's executive MBA program in DC. Which was a great fit because, I wasn't looking for, consulting or finance recruiting. So that was a good fit. And then I stumbled across ETA on accident, really, because, this was 2020, like right in the heart of COVID. And this was before buying a business was cool online, right?
Yeah.
Harvard, Chicago, Stanford, these guys have been doing it for a long time. But, nobody was on LinkedIn or, YouTube saying, hey, you should go buy a business. Boring business was not a term. And so I found it on accident. I was going through an entrepreneurial finance class at NYU, and buried in the back of one of the textbooks was this chapter on M&A multiples for the lower middle market. And it just kind of clicked. I was like, wait a second.
Whoa, those are high.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, people are buying and selling. I mean, we're talking like, a couple $1 million of top line revenue, and we're actually getting like multiple expansion. I was like, it just clicked. I was like, oh my God, I can buy a business. And then that led me to discovering HBS's ETA conference, which I attended in the fall of 21, and then the same conference at Chicago the following year. Reached out to a bunch of people in those circles who are already, either investors or searchers, people who had been successful, and one thing led to another, and I was hooked.
Yeah. All right. So you went to New York Stern School. Now you're these other courses. What's the first start? Oh, I got to start looking for a business to buy.
No, in fact, the first thing was, setting up a career. While I was at NYU, I got recruited by Microsoft. And so there was no way I was going to turn that down. And I went to Microsoft, got into software development, started building the cloud. That led to a career at AWS and HP. So I'd built up a pretty good, big tech career. But at the same time, I was still very much like researching, the self-funded route, which is what I had kind of like determined was going to be the right route for me. And so, while I was working my job, I started a self-funded search right around 2022.
Yeah.
And so, and that was the right fit for me because, some people say that you need to quit your job and search full time. And that works if you're traditionally funded. But, I had a wife, I had a family, and I was already used to, going to school full time while working full time. So, for me, it was just replacing school with searching. And so I put in the effort to search part-time while I was working my job. That was the right risk analysis for me.
All right. And you're looking off hours for businesses in your area, or where were you trying to go to a new geographic area?
Yeah, no, I was looking regionally specific in Southern California because that was home. That was the one thing that I was not willing to negotiate on. But I originally started looking in defense tech, and anything that's IT-enabled government services, because my background in the Air Force was doing acquisitions with defense contractors and financial management. So I was already very familiar with that space. And then obviously my time working in big tech, I knew how to code, I knew how IT infrastructure worked. And so it kind of made sense looking in that route. And I looked at a bunch of businesses during that time, didn't find anything that really fit what I was looking for. And then just chance, had me cross an owner of a landscaping company.
Yeah.
I was doing we were planning on doing a renovation of our home in San Diego, and I called this gentleman. He came out, obviously the owner of a small firm that we had hired in the past. And I tell people it's kind of like when you when you decide you're going to buy a car and then you see that car everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
this
Reticular
guy walked
activity.
in.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. He walked in our house. We started talking, and then it just clicks. I was like, this guy owns the business. He's 75. Like, what is he doing? And
But
my
that's a
search,
clue in itself. Like, what's a 75-year-old doing in my home bidding on a
yeah,
business? Yeah.
exactly. But I mean, he was wonderful, really nice guy. And that kind of completely pivoted my mentality. My search completely shifted from defense tech to landscaping, and I
Yeah.
did a full landscaping search. And after meeting this gentleman, we got lunch the very next week. We had a conversation, and he's like, "Yeah, I've always thought about selling, but the right opportunity hadn't come up. We've been busy since COVID, blah blah blah." And I wasn't certain it was a good business for me because he had a lot of things that were going really well for him. Name recognition was great. Solid sales pipeline. But it was project-based work. We all try to find the commercial stuff. But uh,
Yeah.
and on the backside, there was a lot of things to rebuild in the business. Bookkeeping wasn't great. There were really no systems. And so after a few months of discussing it, we came to an agreement where I was going to come in and and I built a great relationship with him at this point. And so the idea was I was going to come in and kind of help his business part time and see what I could do, because again, like, I'd never ran a business before. I had
Right.
all these
Right.
thoughts and ideas and strategies, but I'd never ran a business. And so I was like, all right, well, how about I come help you out a little bit? Maybe I help you build out some bookkeeping, build out a CRM, build out your online presence, redo your website, things like that, right?
Help you get ready for sale.
Yeah, exactly. How about I help you out a little bit?
Yeah.
And my thought was, and I told him right from the beginning, I was like, look, I'm not sure I'm even going to buy this business, but at the very least, this will help you in your business. It'll help me get some practical experience. And if we decide it's a good way to, to make an acquisition, then we'll do that later. But for now, it's fine. And it was a good deal for both of us. And
Yeah.
so that's what we did. And then I used that time to not only, build a little bit in the business, but at the same time conduct a much more thorough search across landscaping. Now having this gentleman who had been in the business for almost 45 years, and I could fact check stuff with him. Like, hey, what do you think about this? Hey, what do you think about that? And so I was
Yeah.
learning in the industry, which was invaluable.
Yeah. What was the story you told yourself going from tech to an easy to understand business like landscaping? What did you tell yourself? Like, it
Well,
doesn't need to be sophisticated. It's very simple. Like, how'd you
I
convince
think
yourself?
the story there, it wasn't that it was simple, and I think one thing I don't like is the whole idea of the boring business, because these businesses are anything but boring. They're not boring at all, and they're quite complicated, because all the things you remove, on the tech side, you overcomplicate on the human performance side. If you've got dozens of employees and projects going and tens of thousands of dollars on the line every single day with supplies and maintenance and customers and sales, like, these are not boring activities. And the idea that you're going to be able to like kind of sleep through and walk through that is ridiculous. Like, it requires your full attention from 5 a.m. in the morning until 7 p.m. at night, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you never know when a curveball is going to get thrown your way where, maybe some storm comes through and all of a sudden your schedule is completely wiped out. Maybe there's a shortage of materials with supply and now your schedule is completely wiped out. All kinds of stuff that are just, in your way. And at the same time, you're dealing with, you know, not being tech enabled. Like, I'm dealing with you know, the owner, his wife had helped them put together a website back in the early 2000s, and it was functional, it worked, but it definitely looked like it was built in 2001, with like WordPress 101. And then, they had a social media presence, but it wasn't great. They had never, all of their leads came from like Yelp and House and like these other, lead generators, but they never once used Google local service ads or Facebook ads or any of that stuff, from themselves. And so there was like some very basic things we could do to help boost sales. One simple
Yeah.
thing is there's no CRM.
Yeah.
And this is a project based business doing landscape construction for decades. and they had a fantastic reputation, over 100 5-star reviews on Google Maps. And this is from like a team who's not out there like, hey guys, leave us a review. Like, this is just natural, it's organic. And with all of that, they never followed up with a customer. And so, like, right off the bat, I hired a third party contractor to come in, and it sucked for him. He went through all of our paper records for the past like 3 years. And I was like, all I want you to do is get the contact information from customers. That's it. And he took it all, put it in a HubSpot. We blasted out an email, made 7 sales within a week. Like,
Wow.
just
Wow.
basics, just real
And
basics like
and
that.
did this guy, 75-year-old guy, did he want that? I
Yeah,
mean, did he was
yeah.
like, yeah, I'm receptive toward more business, or it was like, I got too much on my plate now. I don't really want any more work.
Well, and see, that was the thing. It was clear that I was not putting more stuff on his plate, because that's definitely not what he would have wanted. What he wanted, and which is something that I found for a lot of sellers, is that they're not looking to sell their business and then retire to Honduras. However, one person I did meet that was exactly their plan, because they had a retirement house in Honduras. But
Wow. Okay.
the vast majority of sellers, when they understand that they need to sell either today, tomorrow, or soon. They're older, they're ready to take a step back. But what they're not going to do is sell their home and move away. Like, they're not leaving the community. And they're also not interested in going and playing golf for the next 3 or 4 years until they break a hip or something. They're interested in doing the things that they enjoy doing and not doing the things they don't enjoy. And so, for instance, with this particular owner, he was interested in meeting with customers. He was interested in doing sales. Like, he loves the people business.
Yeah.
He had fantastic relationships with customers and suppliers and his team. He loved being in the business, but he hates payroll, and he hates bookkeeping, and he hates, all the tech and following up on stuff. Like, he doesn't want to do any of that, any of the admin stuff. No, just take it away. And so the whole agreement from the beginning was like, hey, I'm going to help build systems for all that back end stuff you don't want to deal with. And then ultimately, when we did decide to move forward with the purchase, the idea was that he was going to stay on. He stayed on as a minority owner, but his only role was making sure he was the license holder, especially for the first, 12 months per the contract. That way it would give us time to either get a different license holder or for myself to become licensed.
Right.
So that was, key point number one. But the second was, the idea was that he would be able to continue doing sales calls if he wanted to, but only like a couple times a week, or to be like, like a chairman of the board type guy, like an actual like advisor, which was the kind of thing that he was well suited for. And so, what owners want after they have a sale is going to be highly dependent on that owner. But I found, after meeting with hundreds and hundreds of owners, that the vast majority of them, if you can build a good relationship, they're not trying to like flee town. Like, you should build that relationship so that they can be helpful.
Yeah. When you looked at his books, were they clean? Did you find anything, or were they just messy, not malicious, just unintentional errors?
But they were clean. They were
They
clean.
were clean.
The
Okay.
biggest issue was that they were largely incomplete, I guess is the right word to put it, because they weren't using a formal bookkeeping software. Like I said, he didn't want to deal with any of that stuff. So they ran everything off of a business checking account with a couple business credit cards. And then every single month, they would just simply print off all their transaction history, send it to a local CPA, and be like, put my P&L together.
Yeah.
That was
So
it.
here's our cash in. Here's our cash out. Just
Yeah.
please, let's take all the deductions we are allowed to, and let me know
Yeah.
what taxes I need to pay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds a little ridiculous, but when you've been doing project-based work for decades, then you already have a good idea of what your pipeline looks like. And let's be clear, he has no debt. So at the worst case scenario, if there's no work to do, the guys just stay home, you know?
Yeah.
And sometimes that happens, especially if we have bad weather or something. So it's like he wasn't really running any risk here. It just wasn't optimized.
Yeah. Did he have an office or industrial park or some trucks or anything, or was it run out of his house?
So he used to have an office, but he was kicked out of his commercial space during COVID. Like, there was a warehouse issue that the lease tenant was like, no, we want to move on. And, everything was crazy at that point. And so at that point, he took a bunch of the cash in the business that he had been using, and he simply rebuilt a warehouse on his own property. Not a big space, but he built a warehouse on his own property where he could park the trucks, and he'd have a place where he put supplies in a small, like, 2-man office.
Yeah. All right. So what happened? What's going on with his business? Yeah.
All right. So here's what happened. After about 8 or so months of working in the business, building a great relationship with this owner, And then also proving to myself that, I could actually make an impact in this business. I decided it was worth the opportunity to make the acquisition. And so, he and I, we came to a deal and we were able to close that deal. Deal structure was primarily like about 1/3 cash and then 2/3 seller note. Now, we did it that way, one, because I always planned to use the SBA, but two reasons. One, I didn't need to use the SBA because the transaction wasn't big enough for it to really matter. And the second reason was because I was still, like I said, I was rebuilding the books. It wasn't really financeable because there weren't
Not
like
through
3
SBA.
years of like,
They're going to
not through
need to,
SBA.
yeah.
Yeah. So like I had rebuilt the books there, but it wasn't something that anyone would lend on. And so that was the other reason. But at the same time, and this is what I tell people, I'm like, you in the lower middle market, it's the wild west of capitalism. You could put anything you want in a deal. That being said, there are some people out there who take advantage of sellers. And one of the key things that I did with my seller that a lot of people they try to avoid is we put a personal guarantee on the seller's note. And I felt that was perfectly legitimate. Personal guarantee on a seller's note is exactly the same as it is on an SBA loan. And because we were coming to a point where I'm like, look, if 2/3 of the value of this deal is going to be in the seller's note, and you don't expect me to have more skin in the game, then there's not a lot of trust there. And so that was one of the things we decided to move forward with.
Yeah. Let me ask you how that went, that conversation with your wife. Because I know how it went with my wife, because she's just thinking security. Like, if the house goes, if the cars go, if everything goes, like, what are we left with? How did that conversation go?
So the conversation went kind of like this. We had the conversation when I first started searching about what things would look like if I failed. And to be very fair, we could have had a much deeper conversation on that. And I find that, a lot of people don't actually think about the risks involved, especially with a personal guarantee. And I'm not super special in the sense that like I didn't have extra, analysis about the risk involved. I at least did take the time to think about like, what would happen if I failed? And for me, it was like, all right, well, if I acquire a business and that business does not succeed and we go into bankruptcy, then and let's say we lose everything, what does that look like? Well, I'm like, all right, well, I still have a top 10 MBA. I still have a top secret clearance from the Defense Department. So working for a government contractor is probably a good move. And I still have all this experience in big tech. So I felt pretty confident that my advantages, from that perspective would allow me to, rebound and get back on my feet pretty quickly,
Yeah.
That said, we had that conversation, but I didn't dive any deeper. Like I didn't think about like, what does chapter 7 and chapter 11 look like? What does insolvency look like? And that's one of the things I really harp on now, on LinkedIn and to other current and future searchers. I'm like, I'm not sitting here saying that you should dive into the minutia of what insolvency looks like. But if you don't take the time to really think about what that is, then you're not, in my opinion, you're not actually having a risk analysis. You're not actually looking at the pros and the cons of your deal.
Worst case scenario. Worst case. Yeah.
So for instance, right now, I talk with people who are currently going through bankruptcy on SBA guaranteed debt. And I always start off by telling them, look, you have to expect that you're going to lose everything. You have to go into it understanding that when you file, you're probably going to lose your house, your cars, maybe your pension, like all this stuff. You have to assume it's all gone. Now, that being said, different states have different laws when it comes to homestead. Maybe you get to keep your home. Maybe it wasn't actually written out on your SBA PG. If you're not over that 20% equity threshold. Some states have reservations when it comes to 401ks and retirement accounts, and so there are some possibilities there where you can be able to retain some of your critical assets and still move through bankruptcy. But you are putting everything into the hands of the executor, of the person who is running that bankruptcy.
Yeah, and you can't.
And so you need to understand.
Yeah, and you can't really put anything into a trust, right? To hide that. No,
you can, and this is the part where I say that I am not an attorney, but I have spoken with searchers who have tried to take a few extra steps to help protect themselves. For instance, putting the bulk of their assets in a trust that they don't have control of, or moving their assets into the direct ownership of a spouse or a family member. Can that work? I guess. I mean, theoretically it can. Yeah, I think it just really depends on the person and the situation. Again, speak with your attorney, because then we're talking about like what is actually covered on your personal guarantee, what can and cannot be pierced by the corporate veil.
Yeah, that's
There's a lot of questions there.
yeah, they need some kind of collateral, and if you take your name out
Yeah,
of it, that's not collateral anymore.
exactly. And you're exactly right. I mean, the personal guarantee is the collateral. And so is it possible that you could find a killer deal that a bank would love to lend on and you don't have any collateral, but you still sign the personal guarantee? Sure, there's probably an SBA lender who'd take you up on that. But I mean, good luck, man. Every deal's
Yeah,
different.
but you didn't use SBA. You did seller financing and a third down. So you you take over this business. Everything looks rosy. Where does it start showing off? It's going off the rails.
Almost immediately, and
No.
almost immediately, and it's entirely my fault, and this is why. Um, One of the things I learned is that once you buy a business, all of a sudden you get a certain level of accreditation that everyone else doesn't have. So, for instance, I've been doing a search for well over a year at this point, hundreds of sellers, several LOIs. But once I bought my first business, then people noticed, brokers noticed, owners noticed. They're like, "Oh, this guy actually bought a business," right? And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
word gets out quickly. So, for instance, within the first 30 days after buying the first business, word had spread throughout the entire area that I had acquired this landscaping company. And about four or five other landscaping companies in the same area all noticed and started, questioning whether or not they could have a similar outcome, right? And so, uh, one of the things you realize is like these are very tight knit communities. Like three of the five owners of these businesses all went to high school together in the 70s. Um, the guy, the guy who owned the first business, his wife used to be a secretary for the guy who owned business number three. Like it's like they all know each other, and so
Yeah,
it
it's like
works
the
well.
HVAC business here in Tucson.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
know.
It's
They either
they
worked
know
at
each
that
other.
or
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, they've all been working in the same industry, in the same area for decades, and it's not just them. The employees know each other. The suppliers know each other. Everybody knows. And so very quickly, I found myself, and I tell people, I found myself in an accidental roll up because they're like, oh, this young guy just bought this business. Maybe he'll buy ours, right? And they weren't wrong. I was like, wow, okay, cool,
You got to go back to those multiple expansions you saw, and that's what was driving you. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So like business number one was doing just over 1.5 million top line. And I'm thinking, okay, cool. Well, this opportunity, if I was to then acquire businesses, 2 through 5, now I'm looking at 12 to 15 top line. And there's a lot of mechanics and details when it comes to combining so many businesses together. But the numbers start rolling, and I start thinking, I'm like, wow, that's really cool. And so, mistake number one was just not taking a breath. I should have taken a big step back and a big breath and taken the time to really make sure that business number one was built out to be an appropriate platform before acquiring and expanding. But I
Yeah.
didn't do that.
Let me ask you on that. There's no set time, but do you recommend 6 months, 12 months, or just wait till you get to your sea legs, or what?
Yeah, I agree. There's no set time. I think here's what I would say. When you buy, there's two different types of growth that need to happen. One, there needs to be the business growth. So, like when you buy, you have to learn, especially if you're new to the industry, you have to learn the industry, you have to learn the business, you have to learn the ins and outs. And I'd already been kind of working in this business a little bit part time for like 8 months. So I had a pretty good feel for it, but I was still very fresh to the industry, and I was definitely fresh with being in the owner. And then the other part of that growth is the personal growth of like taking on the responsibility of ownership, understanding like, okay, well, what projects are we going to take? What kind of deals are we going to have? What kind of marketing are we going to do? When is it time to fire this person? When is it time to hire somebody? Like all of these questions, it takes time for you if you've never been in the seat of ownership to actually get comfortable in that seat and then understand like how to move forward effectively. And
Yeah.
so I can't tell you how much time that's going to take. Um, I spoke with Nathan Lindley, who I spoke with him a couple weeks ago, and he's doing a fantastic HVAC roll up in Texas. And he talks about how the personal growth for him took 2 years. And in the meantime, his first business after he bought it, it took him 2 years, and it almost failed in those first 2 years because it took him time to really understand how to be the owner, right? And the best analogy I can give you is it's kind of like the military. Like, I can tell you what it's like to put on the uniform, I can tell you what it's like to deploy, but until you've done it, you have no idea what I'm talking about. And
Yeah.
so I would say give yourself some time. Jump in there, give yourself at least 12 months, not just so that you can build the business and make it, a firm foundation to expand or do whatever you want to do going forward, experience a full fiscal year cycle, but also so you can have time getting comfortable with making some tough decisions. Hopefully, one or two headwinds hits you in those first 12 months, and you got to make some tough calls, and you learn from those, and you start, really getting your arms around this business. So that's probably what I would go with.
Yeah. I think it's just a little naive. I always kind of squash. I've got some students that, buy a business, say, hey, look, don't worry about your second one. We're trying to get the first one here, and you got to get your sea legs. And for instance, like this one right here, the guy you bought it through has gone through 4 cycles. If you take a cycle every 10 years, that's 40 years of learning. There's no way.
Yeah.
That's too arrogant to think that you're going to be able to understand all of what he's learned in 40 years.
You're exactly right. And that's why I tell people the very first mistake was my mistake. It was just new buyer arrogance, thinking that I could just jump in and make this big difference like right off the bat. Taking a break, taking a step back, and really taking the time to not just learn the industry, but also, allow myself to grow into the ownership role would have been a huge advantage.
Yeah. So what happens? Does sales start dropping? You're losing clients. You can't get clients, or what's happening in this project?
Here's what happened. So within 5 weeks after buying the first business, I had already had LOI, due diligence, and bought business number 2.
Oh,
That's what happened. And here's what I tell people. And I love that you brought up the buyers who are like, hey, I want to have a holdco. Hey, I want to do a roll up. I never expected to do a roll up. I learned about them at Stern. I never expected to do that. I had thought about holdcos, but buy business number 1. Buy the first one, build a platform, and then once that's solid, then we can start talking about holdcos or roll-ups or whatever you want to talk about. But if it's your very first business, let's just knock that one out of the park first, because the riskiest business is business number 1.
Yeah.
So here's what happened. So I buy business number 2, and as a brand new buyer and a first-time roll-upper, there were a lot of things that I took for granted and did not understand. The first one being, just because the finances look good does not mean it's a good acquisition, especially in a roll-up. Because when you're doing a roll-up and you're combining companies, culture plays a significant role. Like, you have to make sure that, when you're buying a company, the culture of that company is a direct reflection of the owner themselves, right? And so they've put the systems in place or not. They've hired employees and they've fired employees. They have a certain way that they do things. Even if it's in the same industry and they're doing the same jobs, they have a way that they do things, and that culture comes from the top all the way down to the bottom. And the idea, and this is true for anybody, if you're going to buy a business, the idea that you're going to change that culture is ludicrous. It is going to take time to turn that ship. And you can do it, but it takes 12, 36 months. Like, it takes time to be able to, unless you're planning on firing 80% of the employees within the first week, you're taking over something that's already been built. And so that culture is important. That culture, it's very, very sticky. And so you're dealing with personalities, you're dealing with relationships, and being able to merge those together is incredibly difficult. And I really underestimated what I was getting myself into. And that's beyond. And you notice how I talked about culture first. I didn't talk about systems. I didn't talk about integrating payroll, integrating insurance, integrating CRMs, integrating payment structures. None of that, which all has to get done very, very quickly. And by the way, in landscaping, if you're buying and you're the only tech-enabled individual in the business, that's you, my friend. You're doing all that work. You're the one combining all the payroll systems, combining all the stuff. Like, that's you. Like, if you think that, like, your employee who's running admin, who's been doing it for 50 years, you're gonna trust them to, like, understand how to combine your payroll and negotiate insurance rates for you, I doubt it. You're going to be doing it yourself.
Yeah. So what were some of the initial culture conflicts, roadblocks that you just ran into, going, oh my God, I thought that was going to work, I got to try something else?
Yeah, I mean, teams not wanting to work together, team's not used to trading off leads. There's a little bit of the analysis that I did in the beginning, which I thought would be a big positive, which was true. For instance, business number one was a project-based landscape construction company. And so, the good thing there is that margins are high. The bad thing, though, is that it's project-based. So you're always out there winning new work.
Yeah.
Business number two was a strictly commercial maintenance company. And so the good thing there is that a recurring revenue is solid. We had about $1 million in recurring revenue just on that piece. The downside is that the margins are terrible. We're talking single-digit margins. And not just that, when you're a small business, it's really hard to acquire new clients in that space because large competitors like Brightview will underbid you for 2 or 3 years just to gain a client. And you can't work in negative cash flow. And so you run into a lot of issues there. And one of my thoughts was, well, if I could bring my project-based team and combine them with a commercial-based team, then I basically have acquired customers from my project-based team, right? And so most commercial businesses, they're doing the standard cut and blow, right? They're doing lawn maintenance, they're cutting, they're trimming, but the real margins are in the tree trimming, the turf, the irrigation, the lighting, all that extra stuff, especially if we're going to lay concrete or something like that. And a lot of commercial businesses will subcontract for that work. Well, now we don't have to. We subcontract that internally. So the mechanics of the business structure did make sense, and we did see some progress there. But building the systems that allow those teams to share leads, to think of themselves internally first before moving to an outside contractor, to allowing, thinking, oh, well, I don't do that work, but maybe our other team does, like I've got a commercial client who wants to put in, brand new concrete driveways. Well, instead of just telling them, no, we don't do that, maybe saying, yes, we do that. Actually, we have a whole team for that. So
Right.
It's definitely a learning curve. And especially when you have people who are used to being, the senior leaders in charge, well, who's in charge now with your foreman, right? So who's the top dog, so to speak. So working through a lot of those relationships can be difficult.
Yeah, let me ask you about this because it's the point you feel really alone. It's your vision and you're trying to share your vision and recruit people to your vision doing this, and now you're alone. Like, what was the stress and the life like during that, coming home thinking about it 24 hours a day? I mean, you look at Elon, he goes, he slept at SpaceX. He slept at Tesla round the clock. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to understand the stress level until you've been in it.
Yeah.
Until you stare at the ceiling wondering if payroll is going to clear.
Yeah.
Until that happens, it's a whole different level. It's really hard to understand where you're coming from, and not just because you want things to work out, but because you signed for the debt. So if payroll doesn't clear and people leave, then you're on the hook. And so it's keeping up with sales. But it also means you're taking a lot of faith on your employees because, a lot of people are buying into industries where they don't have experience. And as a result, it's really helpful if you've got 1 or 2 key employees who have a lot of experience who can help, keep the ship moving forward as you're learning. But make no mistake, they kind of got you. They kind of got you during that time.
Yeah.
Right. And so I really relied on my key employees to keep the business moving, and they did fantastic jobs at doing that. But at the same time, I'm trying to get the back end of the business, not only integrated, but fixed. And so while I'm doing that, I'm not working on supplies. I'm not working with the foreman. I'm not working with the teams. I'm working on insurance and sales and CRMs and things and web presence and marketing and advertising, and trying to keep the back end of the business going while also building QuickBooks for the first time. So it definitely is a whole different level of stress.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to patch the holes in the ship while trusting that the crew that you just hired is going to keep the ship floating long enough for you to get it patched up and moving in the right direction.
And you don't even know anybody about those. It's not like you grew up with them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you buy this second commercial business, was that with an SBA loan?
No, same structure.
Uh-huh.
So I'd planned on using the SBA, but in the same scenario, this one would have been financeable, but I didn't need to. I'd already learned enough about the business, and I'd had a positive impact on the first one. And I was like, I went into it like, all right, well, this structure worked on the first time. Let's try it again. And the owner went for it. Now,
Yeah.
again, signing a personal guarantee on the seller's note, but that allows me to get much better terms. So let me clarify. So yes, of course, I signed a personal guarantee for the seller's note, but one of the advantages here is that it allowed me to negotiate the seller's note. So with the seller's note, I negotiated a 15-year amortization in the note, right? But with a 61-month balloon. So that really helps with cash flow. So that really helps me saying, all right, well, we're gonna spread this out a lot, but at the same time, not make you wait 15 years to get paid.
Right.
So it allows you to do things that you couldn't do with the SBA, which made sense in this scenario. But again, that worked for the seller and that worked for me. If it hadn't, we would have had to negotiate something else.
Yeah. What was their condition like? Well, what happens if, you know, you kill the business? I mean, I don't really want it back, but I also have some loyalty to my employees. I don't want them to lose their job. What was the conditions to help them? Yeah.
Well, and here's where things get a little tricky. So, the vast majority. So, let me find the right way to put this. Since my business failed, I've gone through insolvency, bankruptcy, a settlement, and now I'm on the other side. And what I've learned since getting out is that I've met with dozens of people who have had a business fail, who have bought a business in the last 5 years and that business has failed. What I did not expect was that, over 75% of us have the same experience, which is when you go through a business failure, you're most likely going to have a settlement. And that settlement is going to include a non-disclosure, non-disparagement agreement. And so there's two reasons why you don't hear people talk about why their business failed. One is because it sucks. No one wants to get on LinkedIn and be like, hey, I'd like to tell everybody that my business failed. Now I'm
Doesn't get
incredibly underwater.
that doesn't get as many followers as, hey, I just sold my holdco company for $1 billion. Yeah.
It's not fun.
Yeah.
But the second reason is because they can't legally. And so if you're wondering why you don't hear a lot of the negative stories, it's because a lot of times they can't talk about it legally.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why I'm writing my book. It's filled with these stories that are anonymized, but accurate, right? And so what I hear, and I say that because what happens forward is the part that I can't talk about. But what I can say is that based on my experience and the experience of the people that I've already talked to, that I've been interviewing for the book, that all these stories that I've put together, I can start to give you the overall trend analysis that I've found that tends to be the reasons why these deals don't work out.
What is that? The overall trends analysis. Yeah.
All right. So number one, in 65% of cases between the 22 people that I've already interviewed, including myself, in 65% of these cases, the business failure is the direct result of a misalignment with the seller. Now, it's not always a misunderstanding or fraud from the seller, but it's a misalignment. In over half those cases, it's outright fraud. And you may not call it fraud. It may not be called. That's why we have a settlement. That's why we're not going through actual litigation. There's a settlement. But that's what it is. If you sign a non-compete and then your seller opens up the exact same shop across the street day one after signing, well, that's fraud. you messed up. And so that happens.
Actually, I have a story for that. So
yeah, well, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So if you've got a bunch of liabilities in the business that you don't disclose that are material, and then afterwards you buy that business and you discover them, well, that's misrepresentation. And so one of the things that buyers, especially first-time buyers, miss is that they think that they're protecting themselves with a purchase agreement. They think that if my lawyer writes my purchase agreement and puts all my representations and warranties in there to protect me and puts non-compete clauses and puts clawbacks and earnouts and all this stuff, and I protect myself, then I'm safe. And the answer is you're not safe.
You're not safe. I'll tell you. And I got a student that just 1 year later, after he bought the business, opened a shop doing the exact same thing. He had a reps and warranty insurance, strong asset purchase agreement, and a pretty strong lawyer. And he still did it.
Yep, exactly. And here's why. Because you have all of the purchase agreement and those warranties do for you is they give you the legal foundation to sue. But you still have to sue. it still falls on you if you want to get some sort of judgment. And it's not a guarantee that you're going to win. And even if it is, it's expensive. Litigation is very expensive and it takes
Yeah.
time. So if you're going to move as quickly as possible, then you're looking at months of you litigating this with the person that you bought the business from. And in the meantime, you're still dealing with the negative consequences, whatever that happened to be. And so you're trying to
That's
keep
why
this
a lot
business
of people,
afloat.
those no judgment, just say, oh, let's move on. Like, let's move
Yeah,
forward.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we have settlements, because
Yeah.
you get to a point to where you're like, the buyer wants out, the seller wants out. We all just want to stop. And we're like, all right, cool, we're done. And, we're just going to have a settlement and we're done, and that's a story I've heard over and over and over and over again. And I tell people, if everyone acted in their own financial self-interest, then you wouldn't hear these stories. And also behavioral finance wouldn't be a discipline, but it is. Because we all do whatever we want all the time, regardless of the impact, right?
All right.
And so a really great example of that is Justin Williness. He was on Acquiring Minds just a few weeks ago. Bought a business, over $8 million top line, immediately went into battles with the seller about things that weren't disclosed. Ultimately lost his business.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's the number one most important thing. In over 65% of these cases, it's because there's a misalignment with the seller. And I tell people, look, the number one red flag is there are 29 million businesses in America. Do business with someone you can trust. Because as the buyer, you're always at an information disadvantage. There's always asymmetry of information here. And so always do business with someone you can trust. And if you ever feel like the seller of a business is lying to you or is not representing something correctly, or maybe there's just like the hairs are standing on your arm, walk away. It's just not worth it.
Yeah.
So that's the number one.
Let me ask you a question, because your radar is pretty attuned to that. So I had another student. We were looking at a business. I won't say what industry, but some kind of red flags. Individually, they didn't mean anything. So I said, let's keep looking at this. And I'll list these off you. And I said, there was no spend on marketing at all. I asked the broker how the seller gets her business, and he was elusive about that. He goes, "Oh, that's the secret sauce." The broker early in the conversation revealed that the husband or the father has multiple multi-million-dollar businesses. So I thought maybe there was, maybe she leaned on that for that. That's okay. Then I found out the reviews for the reviews on Google were all kind of similar with the same last names, and there weren't very many of them. And then I did a lookup on Data Axle, Reference USA, zero records of that incorporation, and no social media presence at all. Zero. Like nothing on X, nothing on LinkedIn, nothing anywhere. I said, look, individually, I'm just telling the buyers, individually, they're not red flags, but you put them together. What's your thoughts on that? Yeah.
You're painting a picture.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think several of those individually would be red flags for me, but at the same time, you're right. You're painting a mosaic. And, I talk to searchers almost every day. And one of the things that people ask me now, and they're like, hey, based on all of these stories that you've researched, how do I know, what are the things I should be looking for when it comes to the integrity of the seller? And I tell them, look, a lot of it's just the basics when it comes to due diligence, but this is where EQ comes in. This is where EQ comes in. This is where you have to put in the reps of talking to hundreds of sellers and brokers and really building the relationship to know, does this person, did they give you the warm fuzzies? Is there something about them that's off? You have to really kind of hone that skill set. And I can't really tell you how best to do that. What I can tell you is that we all have a sixth sense when it comes to someone who's not acting in integrity. And, it is totally possible for someone to hoodwink you, and that's fine. I get that. But the vast majority of people are pretty straightforward, and how they do one thing is how they do everything else. If someone's got a reputation for stiffing their suppliers, they probably will stiff you. That's why, it's the we laugh about, like, if someone cheated on their wife, they're probably going to cheat on you. People generally,
No, he's
who
not
they
going to do
are is
that.
who they are. Yeah. So, take some time to learn about the person on the other side of the table, and then use your EQ to kind of feel out, is this someone that I can trust? I don't know. Only you can answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. All right. Number two, what was the other kind
Number
of,
two.
yeah.
Number two is huge, and it's probably the one that impacted me the most: cash flow constraint.
Uh-huh.
So, and it's also the number one reason why small businesses go out of business. So, cash conversion cycle. If you don't know what that means, you are not ready to buy a business. It is the amount of time from when you make a sale, from the moment you make that sale, to where that accounts receivable goes all the way through into actual cash in your bank and then paid out in some sort of payable.
And
Whether
if there's
that's
anything left.
and if there's anything left, you need to know how long that takes. That's the cash conversion cycle. And
Yeah.
if you don't know how long that takes, that's step one. And then step two is, how much liquidity do I need from the moment that starts to the moment that ends? That's called working capital. You need to know what that is. If you don't know that, it doesn't matter what business you buy, you will fail, because you can have $1.5 million in accounts receivable, but if you've got $1 in your bank account, you're doomed. You're done.
Yeah.
It's over.
That's why if you go to a balance sheet, it's the very first line on, like, what's your assets.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're running $1 million business, another student was looking at a nice business, and I go, there's only 4,000. These guys are taking $1.5 million, but there's only 4,000 in the account. That's a problem.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. And it's one of those things that's overlooked. And I think searchers are getting better at understanding working capital, and that's a tough conversation with sellers. But I see no improvement over first-time buyers becoming more understanding of cash conversion cycle. It's more than just your working capital. How does your your accounts receivable turn into cash? Let me give you an example. So one of the things we love to see in older businesses that aren't sophisticated is a lack of technology. Because when you see that, you're like, hey, I can implement technology and I can create efficiencies, I can speed things up, I can create value, blah, blah, blah. And that is true. But it's also not easy, and it takes time. So for instance, one of the issues I ran into my business was that 95% of our accounts receivable were all in cash or physical checks, right? And so I look at that and I'm like, oh my goodness, if we just put in some automatic billing, then it's amazing. And we're going to cut our cash conversion cycle, our AR, like in half, and we'll really speed up the efficiency of cash. Okay, that's great. But here's the problem you run into. So one, if your customers have all been paying by check for over 10 years, getting them to pay by Stripe is really tough.
Like, what? Stripe?
I don't know what it is about the average person going on to Amazon.com and not thinking twice about buying something, but then going to your digital invoice and thinking, it's probably a scam. I'm not kidding. It happens.
Yeah.
And so here's what happens. If your customers are paying by check and they put that check in the mail, even if you're in the same city, well, now you got to wait for them to actually mail that check. All right. That can take a couple days. Then you have to wait at least one full day for that check to arrive from their place to your place. And then once that check arrives, you got to sprint to your local bank to deposit it, or you can deposit mobily. You can do that. You got to get that check deposited. And then for us, it would take 2 to 4 days for Chase to clear it.
Yeah. Hold on. You forgot to mention you actually have to remind your account a few times.
That's after you followed up to get them to pay.
Yeah. Hey, man, can you write the check? It's a week. Hey, man.
Yeah.
Can you write the check?
And in the meantime, this is one of the things we talk about with high CapEx companies. I've got trucks breaking every day. I've got machinery breaking every day. I've got payroll. We're running payroll weekly when I took over. And so, one of the things like I had to do about 60 days after I took over was we had to move to bi-weekly payroll because our cash couldn't support a weekly payroll. It just couldn't do it. And that sucks. Now you're impacting your employees and you're letting them know, hey, instead of every week, expect every 2 weeks. That again impacts your culture.
Yeah,
but at the same time, you don't have a choice. I mean, it's either that or the business goes under. Like your cash conversion cannot sustain that. And so these are the types of things that we're talking about. And you're doing all of this while trying to keep the business moving forward. And so understanding your cash conversion cycle, understanding how that impacts working capital, and then making sure that you've got the appropriate amount of liquidity to get you there is vitally important. So if you're buying a business, and 95% of that is going to be through SBA. If you're buying a business, make sure that when you buy, that you go ahead and get that SBA express line of credit, even if you don't need it, especially if you don't need it. Like, make sure it's just sitting in the back. Banks love giving you money when you don't need it. They hate giving you money when you do need it. So just have the extra firepower just in case. If you're looking at a debt service coverage ratio of 1.5, maybe boost it up to 1.7, maybe 2. Like, give yourself a little extra space. Like, do what
I tell you what,
can.
Adam Coffey, man, he says don't go for any deal under 2.
Yeah, I get it. And one of the conversations I had with Joe Odell last November.
Yeah, I know Joe. Yeah,
he's a big proponent of this now. Like, I understand the leverage buyout, but one thing, he did a traditional search, but a lot of the people we talk to are doing self-funded searches, and we know that you can lever up 80, 85, 90%. We know you can do that. And it's possible to find a deal that you can lever 90% and find a 1.5 DSCR. That doesn't mean you should do it, because the riskiest deal you ever do is your first one. There's so much you don't understand about how to run a business, your temperament as an owner, the learning curve. You need to do everything you can to give yourself as much space as possible to be successful. And if that means giving up a little bit of the economic upside, fucking do it. Because what's the alternative? What's the alternative? The alternative is bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So just give yourself every possible advantage to win on deal 1. And then if you win, then dude, deal 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, you're gonna crush it. It's okay. You don't need to get all the chips on the first play. So just give yourself some space. Leverage buyouts are already, incredibly financially tough. There's no need to make it more difficult, especially for someone who's never done one before.
So let me ask you this. So you had this high margin business, you merged with the low margin business. That changed your conversion cycle there.
Absolutely.
You say, what would you say? Never do a deal like this, just buy another high margin business, or how could that be done? Yeah.
I would say that it can absolutely be done. And this is the thing, and this is my very first point, was arrogance of the buyer. Like, if I had just taken the time, 6, 8, even 12 months, if I had just taken that time to really build business number 1, really make sure that our systems were solid, our cash conversion cycle was solid, our CRM was solid, like everything about this business was solid. If I had just done that, and at the same time built relationships with owners 2, 3, 4, and 5, if I had just done that, then it's very possible that over the next 12 to 24 months, I could have acquired all 5 businesses, systematically.
You had to give yourself a little more time to digest.
Yeah, do it in a way that allows you to actually digest the business as you bring it in, to really be very clear about what is the culture I want in my business? Who does fit that mold? Have I built a platform that's strong enough to where if there's somebody who's not going to play ball the way I want to play, can I afford to just let them go without feeling that it's going to risk the revenue of the company? Like, understand that you have to take time to build the first business. And then once you do that, you have all kinds of options. If I had just waited 6 to 12 months, built business number 1, while also nurturing businesses 2 through 5 through, building relationships with those owners and understanding their businesses, today I'd probably be running a $15 million landscaping company in Southern California.
So you tried to purchase 3, 4, and 5.
I had LOIs out the door.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can't.
When the business ultimately went into bankruptcy, I was under LOI with another business that was $8 million. That was right across the street. And so and they had just agreed to sign the LOI. So one of my very first phone calls was to them and be like, "Hey guys, we can't do this. Like, situation has changed." That sucks.
What was the conversation with the first owner, the 75-year-old guy? How was that?
It was tough. It was really tough. I mean, you can imagine he had put he's a wonderful individual. He had put 45 years into building this business. And, luckily for him, he had some other assets. So it wasn't financially ruinous, but it certainly hurt.
Yeah. Here's a guy spent 40 years building a high margin business, and run on small little expenses.
Yep.
Yeah.
And here I go, I lever it and I crash it.
Yeah.
So that sucked, especially since, we had taken the time to build a relationship. And we had also I'd met his family. we had spent time together. And then we had those 8 months ahead of time to really kind of work together. And we had a lot of optimism for the way this could turn out, And
Yeah.
so that was really unfortunate. And when things really did hit the fan, I went out of my way to make sure that as we were going through insolvency, like I made sure that, I carved out as much financial upside for him as possible.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily have to do that, but I did everything I could to make sure that, he at least had something, as a cushion on that one. But it sucks. And that's the other part that we don't talk about is that, when you fail, all your employees get laid off. Your other investors get screwed. Like it's not just, it's not just owner number one and owner number two. I borrowed $200,000 from friends and family, like
Yeah.
from business school colleagues, from veterans I was served with. And so that's a tough phone call when you call somebody up and like, hey man, you
It's
remember
the
that 50
NFL.
grand you
It's the
gave me?
NFL club, man. No friends
Yeah.
left.
You remember how I told you this was going to be great? You remember how I told you could trust me? And then I took your $50,000 and, flushed it down the toilet.
Yeah.
And the best thing I can tell you is that, hey, I'll get it back to you somehow. Like that's a really tough phone call.
Yeah.
That sucks.
Do you have to make amends with those people with that money,
You
or
don't
is the
have to.
settlement
Look,
in
I mean, let's be clear. Like when people engage in business transactions, we all know that when you make an investment or when a business goes under, you don't like. We all know the risks involved, and even if you don't know the risks involved, that's capitalism for you. So you're going to learn either you're going to learn on your own, or the market is going to teach you.
Yeah,
But
I've raised money
again,
before, and then somebody taught me to say this, like, "What's the chance I lose my money?" And I said, tell them right up front, just say 100%. There's a 100%
100%,
chance you're going to lose your money.
absolutely. But here's the other aspect of that. I remember I mentioned the behavioral finance part. It's like, I didn't borrow money from professional investors or institutions. I borrowed money from friends and family. And
Yeah,
so for me, it's a question of integrity. Like they trusted me with their cash. These are not rich people. And so I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I do know that I'm going to pay them back.
yeah. So you go through this bankruptcy and the settlement, and the dust is a little bit settled. What are you doing now to like move forward? What's different about your?
All right. So two things I'm doing. First and foremost, I'm taking everything I've learned and trying to help current and future buyers, mostly first time buyers, understand the realities of what it means when they sign on the dotted line and buy a business.
Yeah,
I'm a huge fan of buying businesses. I think ETA is a fantastic opportunity for the right buyer and the right business. But as you see, John, like everybody online out there is telling you to go buy a business, and not just buy a business, buy a risky one. Sign a personal guarantee, buy 12 of them, build a portfolio of businesses. And there's zero conversation about risk. We hear things tossed around like passive income and buying with no money down and 100% seller financing and just ridiculousness. And after my business failed, like I kind of pulled away. I pulled away for a few months, trying to figure things out. And around September of 2024, I reemerged, logged onto LinkedIn, and I was just being bombarded with this like buy a business BS that you see from influencers everywhere. And with zero regard for the risk involved, no conversation about risk at all. And it really bothered me. It really got me passionate about it. And that's why you see me like just posting about it on LinkedIn all the time, because if you're not having a clear understanding of the risks, then you're not making an investment. You're gambling.
yeah. Russell Brunson calls that turning your mess into the message.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's exactly it. Yeah.
yeah. There's a huge amount of risk, man. Like my business almost failed, and I had this come to Jesus with my suppliers and my investors, and I had them out here at my house talking like, "Here's my plan. I need a little room."
Yeah. I mean, here's a great example. I saw a post this morning from someone who was like, having a job is way more risky than buying a business because your job can fire you at any time. And I'm like, look, I understand where you're coming from. Like, you don't have to preach to this choir, all right? Like, yeah. I mean, you definitely need to understand that when you're an employee, it is right to work. You can be laid off at any time for any reason. You have to protect yourself. You have to build your own assets. But the idea that it's, quote, riskier than buying a business is ludicrous. Because when you get laid off, obviously, it could take time for you to find another business. Obviously, it's an impact to your finances and your savings and everything else. But you're almost never on the hook for personally guaranteed debt associated with that business, right? Like, that is a completely different playing field here. And I'm not telling you shouldn't buy a business, but I am saying that if someone out there is telling you that the only way for you to be financially secure is to leave your job and buy a business, then they've got something to sell you.
Yeah, that's
Because you could use your income and buy some rental properties. You could invest in low cost ETFs and tax sheltered accounts. You could do all kinds of things, and it might be slower, but the risk profile is different. But again, I mean, if you really think business ownership is for you, then take the time to find the right business that's the right fit for you, and you've done the proper risk analysis to make that as successful as possible on move number one. Like, don't think that it's like this panacea where things are just going to work out, because that's the other thing we fall into. We see the low default rates of SBA loans, and we think, oh, well, it's a done deal. It's easy. Like, over 90%, I'm going to be successful. You know what it feels like to be one of those 9% who defaults on a $4 million SBA debt? It is life-changing. It is life-changing. And those stories are in the book as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. So what was the name of that book again?
So it's called Buyer Beware. It's on pre-sale now, but it'll be launched this fall, right around Halloween. We're trying to line it up with the HBS conference.
Awesome. I'm going to put the link to the book in the notes and the YouTube and my site. So, Jed, thank you very much for sharing your story. Really appreciate that. Words of warning.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Like I said, sometimes people look and see what I'm doing online and they think that I'm against the buying a business space. And I'm a huge proponent. I'm just against the rose-colored glasses that it feels like everybody's looking at it with.
Yeah, it's just like a lot of the clickbait stuff that you say, going from, hey, 100% seller financing to there's no risk. There's huge. And you've got to understand or mitigate the risk, or just say no. It's better to just say no.
Oh. Yeah, you mitigate as much risk as you possibly can. You understand that there's always risk and you can't mitigate all of it. And then you also understand that the worst deal is a deal that's a bad deal. The worst deal is not stepping away. The worst deal is a bad deal. And so here's a great example. Like, I run into people all the time who are hoping to buy their first business, and they're totally fine. They don't think twice about signing a personal guarantee for $3, $4, $5 million. But then they stress about spending $20,000 on a quality of earnings. That is a fundamental misalignment of risk. You can't spend $20,000 on a quality of earnings, but you're ready to sign for $3, $4 million of debt. And if your answer is, well, I don't have $20,000 of cash for quality of earnings, then my argument would be you're not ready to buy a business.
That's right. Yeah. Hey, I do have one more question before we go. Did you have mentors or advisors that you could go to during this? Yeah.
Yeah, I was lucky. I had a lot of great mentors and advisors. Like I said, I had spent a lot of time reaching out to searchers who had been successful. And even when I pivoted into landscaping, I reached out to a couple different people who had bought landscaping firms as ETA searchers. And they were really, really helpful. And that's one of the things I love about the space, is that, there's a lot of people out there who, if you message them, they're more than happy to hop on a call with you and talk to you. Now, granted, it's a lot better now. I mean, when I started, there weren't the ecosystem has grown so much, with the involvement of small business focused law firms and CPA firms and quality of earnings. There wasn't a lot of that even 5 years ago. And so now the space has grown so much that
there's new asset classes too. Yeah, new asset class for down payments, a whole bunch of new service offerings around that. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Jed, thank you so much for being on the show.
John, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
All right, let me